Today, we want to start talking about we've talked about how we defined places a little bit in the past, but since then we've obviously gone joined with Bromford and Flagship together, newly named as Bromford Flagship. And we cover obviously a very wide geography, and for a housing association, we're very, very big. And one of the things that was in the business case in bringing these two organizations together is about obviously we want to be, financially strong and be able to serve our customers and our residents really, really well. But we want to retain a local feel and be increasingly focused around our places. And that's what we want to talk about today. So, with that in mind, I'll just do a very, very quick reminder before we go into the subject of today's webinar what place-based working in. So let's just remind ourselves when we talk about place, we're talking about being person-centered and bottom-up and starting with a view of what is the view of the people who live in the place and a picture of the system from a local perspective and starting from that point of view. And, we often say there's kind of three big principles of place and place-based working. The first is it's not a one size fits all. Places are different. There's different contexts. There's different things going on, and it's about moving away from a one size fits all model. The principle two is by default it's bottom up. It has to be. It has to start with the people who live in the place, and it's not just a landlord-tenant relationship. So we're a housing association, but it's as important to form a relational approach with other stakeholders who are operating in that place and the wider community. So it's absolutely not a kind of binary landlord-tenant relationship. And the third principle, which is a really, really important one, is it's not about more money. It's not about throwing more money at things. It's actually should be, if it's really successful, cost less money because it's about pooling resources and not duplicating work that other people are doing. So it should cost less, or at very, very least, at least deliver significantly more for the same value. I'm going to go over so we've got a really good resident perspective today as well. And I want to go over to Debs and Delphine, first of all, because before we get into deciding what is a place, we really started, Debs, talking to residents, first of all, about this, didn't we? We started talking about the first place pilot in Staple Hill with residents before we even assembled a team, and we'd even discussed it with colleagues. So let's go back to the beginning when we first started talking to residents about this. Why do you think place and place-based approaches are important to residents?
Okay, thanks, Paul. Hi, everyone. So my name's Debs. As Paul said, I live in a little village called Wickwar in the Cotswolds. It's currently about 30 degrees, so I'm really happy to be here in the office today because it's air conditioned. But I feel personally, when I was involved with Merlin, and then obviously in 2018, we went through the merger and became part of Bromford. And I remember personally thinking back then that it's great that we're getting bigger from a financial point of view and financial strength, but we really need to maintain local connections and local knowledge. So for me, I think that the thought process started right back then, but certainly with now the merger with Bromford Flagship, it's the need for it is even more. But it's a no-brainer for me. It's going to be so much easier to make reasonable adjustments, to gain local knowledge, to have a better understanding about the kind of investment that we need to put into certain communities, and recognizing that each community is different. It's got different needs, different people, and different assets. And as Paul said, no one size fits all.
And that came about, that what you just said there wasn't really just your personal view, was it? In terms of other residents, reiterated that message really in terms of Delphine, things being very different in terms of the requirements.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think one thing that was quite noticeable is that it wasn't difficult to have a discussion with customers about place. Once the introduction was done, customers had a lot to say about it and could immediately sort of connect to concept. There's sort of greater visibility of the community assets and the wider community anchor organizations and how they would work together at a place level was really something customers were keen to see happen. A better understanding of the local communities and what the gaps are so that we can then fill those gaps and have tailored solutions for those gaps. But also, I think, interestingly, it was a bit of a change of relationship with the housing provider in terms of Bromford then can sort of work on our side And there was this idea that, Bromford could stand with us and use its position and influence, for example, to improve some of the communities in terms of maybe promoting a new bus route, making sure that the community hub has all the services that the community needs to thrive, or even using bits of lands that weren't being used and where more things could happen. So it was really that sort of changing that relationship as well, which was interesting and really positive.
I think it was empowerment of the local colleagues as well that was really important. So in the pilots, what we found is the place-based manager is far more able to kind of speak to the business and cut through some of the unnecessary policy, and they just feel empowered to actually deal with the situation in hand, as opposed to just referring to policy.
Yeah, absolutely. It just reminded me when you were talking then as well, though, it was quite interesting how the conversation with residents is different, because when you start talking from an organisation perspective, people start talking about the demand issues, the kind of the pull on Bromford flagship from residents in terms of things like repairs volumes, contacts, all of that demand-led stuff. But the resident conversation started very, very differently to that in terms of what you just said about kind of assets. Delphine, could you just talk a little bit more about what you mean when you talk about assets?
So really, it's the people in the community, also the third sector organizations, the charities, the informal local groups that are in place, any faith groups, but also the universities, the employers, the local shops, the parks. So all those assets that can be made to really help our communities thrive. They felt that place would really enable colleagues and customers to have time to discuss them, understand them, identify them, and actually say, well, if there's a gap here in terms of after school provision, let's have a look at what we could do and work with other stakeholders in the community to fill that gap. But it wouldn't just be coming from Bromford colleagues. It would be a different proposition where customers would also be involved in those community conversations.
Yeah, and crucially, sorry, Debs, I'll let you in, but crucially, those things are different in different places, aren't they? And that's the point of it, essentially. So some places will have loads of assets and loads of strengths. Others might have not the same level of connectivity locally. And we definitely picked that up, didn't we, Debs?
Absolutely. And one of the things I'm really excited about is I kind of envisage, so we're going to have a place-based hub as an example. And over time, we would expect the staff within that place-based hub, as Delphine said, to be aware of all the community assets, whether it be from local authority or charities or groups. And then I can see a place where even non-Bromford flagship residents, but just other members of that community can go, I need to know about groups or what's going on in the area. I can go to the Bromford flagship place and find out. So I can see how we can be offering to the wider community, the wider residents in the community, and just get better engagement all round from it.
Now, that's a great link to the next section, because actually there's places where we've got a heavy Bromford flagship presence in terms of the number of our homes, and there's places where we haven't got the same kind of density and number of homes and number of residents. So I'm going to move on for the moment to Mark and Henry, just to introduce you both. Obviously, as I said, to tailor services and investments, we need to define where our places are. So, how have you used the data to define what makes a place, and tell us about the method?
Yeah, absolutely. I suppose a bit counterintuitively, instead of starting with how we have used data, I think it's probably timely to talk about what we haven't used and why we haven't used it. So you can see here we're trying to pull a distinct difference between, characteristics that actually define a place as opposed to characteristics that describe what that place is like. Because there's a recognition that, places exist, whether Bromford flagship have homes there or not. But we do have an influence on what those places are like, depending on how, the services are delivered, and also our attitude kind of strategically about what the future could be alongside that customer voice about what we might seek to change about those places. So we can see on the left here kind of things that define a place are relatively permanent. It's that permanency factor, which is really, really key. And because of that permanency, it tends to be physical, structural things about the place that will define it. So there's a few examples there underneath. So location and geography. So it's kind of, is it a coastal place? Is it an urban versus a rural place? The physical landscape, Bath City will always be in a valley. That won't change over time. So that can be used to define the place. Or kind of the historical legacy. Places in the West Midlands have a very, strong history in industrialization and heavy industry. That historic legacy will not change. And it's also unlikely that kind of infrastructure will change. So by that, I mean major roads, major railways, ports, etc. Those things are not built very often. And therefore, that can kind of define what a place is and what it's like, and kind of also governance and administrative boundaries. So kind of your district and borough councils, your county councils, the boundaries of those things don't change very often. Whereas on the right-hand side, these are more transient, more dynamic kind of characteristics. So what are the economic conditions like? Levels of employment, income, wages, and kind of how that fits into kind of housing affordability. Those things can change quite quickly depending on, whether an employer moves in or out of an area. The cultural feel can change quite quickly too. Things like gentrification can quite quickly over the period of, 5 years or so, can absolutely change what a place feels like, how you would describe that place. And also kind of things that can be intervened with through policy or kind of changes to public services. They can also be changed quite quickly with a different focus in policy. So it's important to distinguish between those two kind of sets of characteristics that we have focused on that left-hand side, those permanent physical structural things about places, whereas we've moved away from those kind of more descriptive statistics, some of which is kind of data that we collect ourselves about places. Like we talked about demand and repairs and how many contacts we have with customers in each place. That can change very, very quickly depending on, people moving in and out of the area, how suitable that property is to their needs, etc. Actually, that's probably not a very good way of trying to define the boundaries around places.
Yeah, that's a really just good point there, Mark. In that whole thing of, those things can change very quickly and dynamically. Therefore, if you lock yourself into a very kind of static approach that isn't adaptable, you're stuck with that for a very long time. I know you're going to expand upon this in a minute, but I do really like this idea that recognizing, we have no influence on where existing places are, but we do have an influence on what existing places are like. And that's not equal everywhere, is it? Which you're going to go on to in a minute in terms of explaining.
Absolutely. And so kind of building on those principles about what we think should define a place. So those things that are permanent, that physical geography, and location, and also kind of the urban versus rural kind of description that doesn't change very often. That takes a while. But that's kind of the core principles that we've built our approach to trying to define where those places are. So we try to do this scientifically. I mean, it's as we'll come on to later, it's as much art as it is science. But basically, the core principle that we've used is number one. If you look at that on the right hand side there of that diagram, number one, group properties based on distance. That's a really simple principle that underlines this whole exercise. Because we're only looking at Bromford properties, those properties that are closer together are much more likely to be part of the same community, the same place, than properties that are far apart. That's really, quite obvious, but it's always good to start with the simple stuff. And then kind of moving around the circle, those points 2 through 5, they're used to kind of limit the scope of how big those places can be, and to try and make sure that every property inside a place boundary are as similar as possible to each other. So we've separated urban and rural properties as defined by the ONS. We want them to be in the same local authority to try and simplify the building of relationships with the local authority and the processes for the teams that work there. Often those processes can be different across different local authorities. So we want to try and simplify that as much as possible. We've also asked kind of the algorithm that Henry will explain in a minute. We've asked that kind of mathematical function to average out at 450 properties per place. Every place or kind of every place where we own homes will be big enough for us to kind of serve in a place-based model. There has to be some recognition that there are operational kind of limits to what we can do. And we've set that limit at a place needs to be pretty much at least 450 properties. We've set that in the exercise 2. And we also that minimum weighted density score is basically to try and make sure that these places do not spread over massive geographies. We want them to be tight because they need to be proper communities that are recognised by the people that live and work there.
Yeah, Henry, just give us a quick overview and then we'll skip back in terms of kind of what that kind of means in practice. So, Henry, data scientist, Innovator of the Year, newly crowned as well. So, congratulations on that for this work. Yeah, so talk us through quickly, Henry.
If we go just back to the previous slide, it details the two algorithms used. I use two algorithms, k-means and dbScan, mainly because they serve different purposes. They have different strengths. So k-means was good discovering where our overall large neighborhoods are or regions. And it gives us control over how many places we want, and then gives us that control of trying to get 450 properties as a minimum per place. What it doesn't do is detect properties that wouldn't fall in place. So, that property that's miles away from that central dense area. And that's where dbScan comes in. So DB stands for density based. And that's what it does. It will find properties that just don't fall within that dense cluster center and give us that appropriate label so we can label them as such. So the colored dots, and we have run out of colors a bit here, so I think the two pinks aren't the same, but the colored dots are essentially the places, so where we have that density and the number of properties. And the gray diamonds are those outlier properties that are just too far away from a place or not in sufficient numbers to form their own place, really. So that's the top high level overview of the data model inside of place-based.
That's really useful and very simply explained. And just moving on in terms of just the first look at we're talking about Bromford flagship. We tend to talk generally, so people know, about a west and an east, because that's largely how they line up. So can we talk about kind of just some of the early stage results looking at the east?
So it should be said that this work kind of started pre-merger. So we have Bromford and we have flagship. This work started in Bromford, and then kind of as we came together into the merger, we've kind of started the exercise on the eastern region in flagship's geography too. It should be said that it needs more work, the eastern region analysis, but this is kind of an early stage look at what it looks like. We did exactly the same exercise with the same parameters, asked Henry to essentially do exactly the same thing based on this flagship set of properties, and roughly 19 to 20 places have been identified. But it should be said that there's lots of places that fall just underneath that 450 threshold that are close to other places too. So that kind of suggests to me that there's kind of more work required to potentially adjust that 450 parameter to kind of tweak our approach to defining those places in the east. And absolutely, as we did with kind of our western region, we should absolutely be consulting with those who know those places better than we do about how we can make manual adjustments to really make sure that we're capturing real places, real communities that people who live and work there identify with.
Yeah, thanks for that. Let's just skip back to Debs and Delphine, and then thinking about, we're going to look at some initial results in a minute, but just thinking about having a more focused approach on places. How do you feel that might, because you've talked about other stakeholders and strengths and assets, how do you think that might change the relationship between residents, Bromford flagship and other stakeholders, being that in some places we will be able to get more local, for want of a better word?
Well, I personally feel that it's going to help to reduce the stigma of social housing overall. It will take time, but I think it will give us better visibility within these communities. And, for example, if we've given money to put a chalkboard on the end of a block of flats so that kids can use it, or we've put money into a park locally so that kids can use it, it just raises visibility of Bromford flagship and just how strong we are within those communities. And as I said before, I think it will encourage other non-Bromford flagship customers to kind of approach us to find out what is going on in their community. So Bromford flagship ideally would become a bit of a beacon within those communities.
Yeah, I mean, it's interestingly, Ali has posted something in the chat basically saying about, there's a few comments about broadband in an area not being good enough, and approached Virgin Media a number of times, not done anything about it. Basically saying, come on, Bromford flagship, use your influence with these companies to kind of do something about it. So in terms of what you just referred to there, that's not the typical sort of engagement we'd be doing, but it's really important to residents in that place. If the place is underserved by high-speed internet access, that's got a huge effect on their lives. And where we have got influence, maybe we could start a dialogue about those sort of things. So it changes the kind of things we talk about, wouldn't it?
especially as we know a lot of customers these days also need to work from home. So that needs to be taken into consideration for them to be able to thrive. I think for me, it's going to increase the number of conversations we're having. So customer to customer, customer to other community members, then the housing provider with other, local stakeholders. And all these conversations are just really helping us understand the local needs, local investment, local knowledge, and also helping us develop common projects going forward. So it's very much about building that trust as well. One of our involved customers, Sky, is always talking about trust building. That is really important. Some places will be coming from maybe more difficult social issues, and therefore you need to build that trust. And how do you build trust? By being more visible. How are you more visible? By having more conversations. And maybe in some cases it will take time, but an engaged customer generally is always more satisfied than one that is feeling isolated and not part of either, anything the housing provider is offering, or no community links, no community cohesion to sort of make them feel like they're at home.
Yeah, absolutely. That's really important. Janet Smith in the chat has said, well, yeah, this is great, but how do you account for standalone properties then, and this difference between actually some areas where we've got a lot of homes and others where we have not? So could you give us a kind of initial kind of where we've got to with that thinking about the forming into places and the other areas?
Sorry, thanks, Paul. So this is obviously a map where we think we've identified where places could be, but that does not extend to include every single property. I suppose this is one half of a list where we're saying that we think in these places on the screen here that we have a big enough footprint in the local place that we can have a bigger impact by working in a place-based way, investing in a place-based way to actually kind of work together with people that live in these communities to actually improve the place, people that live there, other kind of third sector organizations too, including the councils. So it's kind of trying to distinguish those places where we think we can have a bigger impact from those where principally we just own a few homes. But that absolutely does mean that so across these 38 places, that covers about 60% of Bromford's homes. So there is 40% that don't fall into a kind of coherent place where we have that big footprint. So what do we do about those? We need a different answer. And I think we'll talk about that in a little bit.
Yeah, and just before I kind of move that on. So massive caveat here for people watching and listening, and particularly we're talking here, we haven't done this level of exercise in the East yet. That's got to be done. And if you're thinking I work in this area, I've got a home in this area, we're moving away from it. That's absolutely not happening. It's just that we're recognizing there's a difference here, which we'll go on to. So do not panic. We're going absolutely nowhere. It's just recognizing there's places where there's potentially greater impact than others. And South Gloucestershire is just a good example of that, Mark, isn't it? Where we've got nearly 90% of the housing association homes. That's correct, isn't it?
Yeah, we're by far the biggest owner of social housing across the district. But even within that, there are kind of distinct kind of places dotted on the map, as you can see here, where kind of we will own probably almost 100% of the social housing in these places. It's really, really densely populated, especially around kind of the edge of Bristol City. But even within South Gloucestershire, there are around about, I think it's about 1,300 or 1,500 homes that don't fit into one of these places. And that's not to say that, there's going to be a second-rate service for any of these people. It's just simply a recognition that there is more of a kind of strategic impact that we can have in some of these communities, even though everybody should get a really high-quality landlord service from Bromford flagship.
Right, okay. And South Staffordshire then, which is our fourth pilot area, not gone live yet, that is a good example then, isn't it, Mark, of the latter, essentially, of the where it doesn't naturally form into a place, but of course, South Staffordshire is a place made up of a number of villages.
Yeah, exactly right. And so you can see here that, so for those that don't know, we're not talking about the orange dots on the screen here. It's kind of a bit of a horseshoe that kind of arcs around Wolverhampton, where we kind of have the labels of the places. So we own about 1,000 or just shy of 1,000 homes in South Staffordshire, and you can see some of the biggest kind of clusterings of properties that we have in the district there. That is to say, so in South Staffordshire, we own around about 10 or 12% of the social housing. So really quite a small amount relative. We are not the major player. So it's just recognizing that we will have a different kind of strategic relationship, a different level of relationship with the local authority, because if they want to talk about social housing, they'll be talking to the other providers who provide the biggest amount of or the most social housing. So just to, we have less properties overall. It's less than 1,000, whereas, in comparison to South Gloucestershire, we've got around about 7,000, I think. It's a much more spread out geography compared to those really tight clusters in Staple Hill and Kingswood that we see in South Gloucestershire. We own a lower proportion of the social housing, as I just mentioned. And therefore, because of that, there are less of our resources that are, deployed. There's less people that work full time in South Staffordshire because there's less to do there. There's less properties, there's less people or less customers for us to serve. And as I said, that changes the kind of relationship that you have with the local authority. So that means that what works in Staple Hill or Moreton in Marsh or South Lichfield won't necessarily work. And we don't think it will work very well in South Staffordshire. So a different answer is needed. And that kind of, I suppose, would open up us to talk about kind of a future pilot for.
Yeah, absolutely. And we'll be coming back in another webinar where we talk about that in much more detail. So I'm going to go to a few questions, so I'll dot them about a bit. There's a good one here. Palanvir made a really good question about, does the density part of the place definition influence how we deliver new homes? Do we want our new homes pipeline to deliver more places or avoid creating such places? Mark, I'm going to put you on the spot on that one. Do you want to handle that?
Yeah, because it's a fantastic question. And the answer is, at the moment, it doesn't in the way that we operate and build homes at the moment. But moving to a place-based model allows you to actually consider that and make a strategic decision about, should we be building only around, existing places? Should we be building around those places that fall just below the place threshold to kind of elevate them into that place-based bracket? Or do we not care about where we build houses and every home is the same wherever it's built, in the middle of nowhere or near one of our places? To me, the answer is obvious, that when you're moving to a place-based approach, that there should be that consideration, probably a decision above my pay grade about, exactly how that strategic decision unravels. But it absolutely makes sense that, building homes in and around our existing communities where we think we can have a bigger impact should kind of increase the impact of building that single home.
Yeah, absolutely. And, Rachel, I think, referred to it in the previous webinar when we're talking about housing in the Cotswolds and the fact that we hadn't developed shared ownership, which was badly needed in that area. So it comes down to, as well, that place standard in terms of what's needed in a particular place. What do the people living there think is needed, and what does the kind of the demographics say about it? So it's a fantastic question that will be circling back on time after time, really, in terms of how do we kind of build on this model and utilize it to make those more strategic decisions, as well as kind of focusing on locally what's needed. Chris Kinnear in the chat has asked a question. I'll put this to you, Henry, if I can. With the difference in a number of places which do not meet the 450 homes number, if you drop this to 375, for example, do you think you'd find a lot more places?
Yeah, you would with K-means. If you set it to one home per cluster, for example, you'd get 48,000 clusters and 48,000 places across the whole Bromford side of Bromford flagship. So yes, that would be the effect. That's where DB scan comes in, because that takes a more density-based approach. So it would notice that, well, this set of properties doesn't meet their threshold that would naturally lend itself to be in a place. So there was an experiment to see how many places changed as we changed the threshold of number of properties per place. And for the 450, it was a guide for the algorithm. If it can't make a place of 450, some might be slightly below, some might be much higher than that. It tries not to be subjective, but use our prompts as guides, really. So the short answer is yes, but we factored that in and made sure it just made sure it made sense, essentially.
No, excellent, Henry. Thank you. Sky's making the point in the chat that, looking at the adjacent places, she's particularly referring to South Gloucestershire, I imagine. She can see how different they can be in kind of character, demographic and needs, even within South Gloucestershire, supporting your point, Mark, really, in terms of it's very different things going on. And that's the thing, just go back to Delphine and Debs on that point, actually. That was very much supported by residents, wasn't it, in terms of it might look geographically close on a map, but actually there's very, very different issues according to where I live and where I could need support.
Thank you, Paul. I mean, I think I said before, I think it's a brilliant idea for us to kick this off with it being data-led, just to give us some kind of rough idea of what we're looking at. It's just important to reiterate that this will be, or will need to be, a very organic process. And if you plant a tree, there's going to be lots of roots, but you can't forecast exactly where each root's going to go. And I think organically, we just need to work with it and be flexible at all times as these communities emerge.
Yeah, it's a live conversation at the moment, as I was saying earlier to you, Debs, in terms of it'd be very easy just to say, let's divide all of our homes up into 1,000, say, or whatever, and just have very neat bundles. But it's actually people and communities aren't neat little bundles, essentially. And in terms of if you're going to do it bottom up, you've got to work to what works best contextually and work forward from there. Sky's just make the point it's an evolving and dynamic process, and I think it absolutely is. Nina's asked the question, Mark, of when is South Staff's place due to go live? We've had an initial workshop, haven't we? And we've got to move forward on that.
Yeah, absolutely. So we've kind of pulled colleagues together who work across South Staffordshire, basically positing the question, how could we work slightly differently? Because we know that the existing pilot models that we've used elsewhere, we don't think that that's going to be particularly suitable. So the best way to generate ideas and kind of get to the best ideas is actually to involve the people who are going to be working there. So that we've had that initial kickoff workshop. We are in the process of getting one in the diary probably in the next month or two to follow up on that and to discuss kind of different models. I'm not sure we have an exact go live date yet. I don't know if I want to take a guess about when that might kick off, but yeah, I'd say that's the kind of the process that we're on at the moment.
Yeah, and Sky's also put some suggestions about what you could explore in an area like South Staffs, and there is some relevance to that because there's another chat going on within the chat, which is about like internet provision in certain areas being really poor. Now, South Staffs is a good example of where that is not a place that's a problem. I was talking to someone from South Staffs the other day who's got a similar kind of place-based approach from the local authority, and they're saying, there's 97% access to super fast broadband. There might be an issue paying for it, but in terms of the infrastructure's there, it is clear that is not true on many of the places that people are talking about within the chat. And so it goes to that point of there's very different things. Sky's also making the point of, could we do sort of road shows and general projects within an area like South Staffordshire? The point I'd make, Sky, though, as well, is that we know that the other housing associations who are bigger than us in that area, in areas like that, plus the local authority, already do a lot of those things. So it comes back to the strengths-based and asset-based approach that Delphine talked about. There's no point Romford flagship duplicating what is already there and what's already strong in those places. And that's part of this model. Where is their strengths and where are their weaknesses? And start from the point of looking for the strengths. Debs, you've got a point on that.
I think it's a no-brainer for me that in those areas where other housing providers are more prominent, that if they are having a roadshow or putting something on, but we've got some properties in that area, why don't we tag along and say, can we have a stand?
Absolutely. Place-based working works best when it's a full partnership approach. It's not going back to that thing, isn't it? It's not about Bromford flagship and the residents. It's about Bromford flagship, the residents, the other stakeholders. And that's something I know residents are really keen we explore, aren't they, Delphine, and feel there's like a space to move into with that.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think in terms of feeling that they've got a greater role to play in developing that community, in achieving community cohesion, in having, events and referrals and hubs that are vibrant, being able to see that other stakeholders are interested in their place and not sort of saying, oh, well, we don't really do any work over there, etc. And again, that stigma, I think, is really stimulating, and they really value it and want to see more of that. And it's just about, how do we do that? What kind of engagement? How do we get to that point where we have enough of those community conversations? And it's just about us all thinking about all the different ways that we can use all the different touch points to get that information so that we can do something really good with it.
Yeah, spot on. Sky's again talking in the chat, and I was talking to South Staffs the other day, and they were talking about the idea of a community of communities, thinking about there are individual places, but we form a community together, which is exactly what we're trying to do as part of this work. Comment from Palmville saying that it feels like the work is identifying opportunities where we can make an impact on place, which support the new homes teams with targeted delivery. It's exactly that. Where best to target and where best to build. So thank you for all your questions and contributions. Do keep in touch. We are going to have a webinar in August, but we haven't lined up the exact guest and date yet. So we're doing that at the moment. So we'll keep in contact with our socials that you've got links to here. Join our LinkedIn group, Place-Based Working Discussion Group. Listen to our podcast. Follow us on YouTube. Thank you so much so as I say, we'll see you in August. Place continues to move forward and it's a really exciting journey. So thank you very much, and we'll see you next time. Enjoy the sunshine.